Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, we are going to be continuing with entering into the Sea of Wisdom, the secrets of unifications, the secrets of Yichudim, in line with the promise of Mashiach Tzidkenu to the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, that the Mashiach will arrive Kishiyasim Yichudim Chamoischa, Kishim Yichudim Chamoischa, when the world is capable of engaging in the process of unifications just like you. And we spoke last week about how the entire concept of entering into the space of Yichudim, the entire concept of entering into a place where one can consider themselves as a person worthy of contemplating the names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of meditating upon the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and beginning to access the ladder of spiritual growth to the point that not only can a person experience hasaga, or the grasp of something, which is a feeling that I'm grasping something real that I can check off the box, but in addition, that a person should be able to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu properly. We spoke about how the necessity, the prerequisite for that, is a willingness to pretend, an authentic pretending, an acting of ki'ilu, because ultimately the Tanayim and the pre-requirements that are necessary for an individual to have come to a place where they are worthy of carrying the name of Baal Yichud, or one who is Miyached, is, at least again, and everything that I say is only speaking for myself and from myself, and ultimately anybody who chooses to listen. But to wait until those prerequisites have arrived would mean to wait forever. And ultimately, the pathway towards Yichudim as a prerequisite for the arrival of Mashiach Tzidkenu needs to be with the permission that we give ourselves to act as if, ki'ilu, to imagine ourselves as if we are worthy of this, and to own the fact that, in spite of the fact that there might be some motivations that are not yet refined to the degree of pure lishma, and that we might still be stuck in some of the gimel klipos of kina, taiva, and kavod, of wanting to be seen, or wanting to be heard, or wanting to be understood, or wanting to be acknowledged, all of the secondary reasons that a person might do something. We have a cloud that we're able to put those aside, kolzman, that we're aware that that's the goal that we want to get to. As we say, mitoch shelo lishma balishma, that if a person wants to arrive at authenticity, they have to do it by way of inauthenticity. Mitoch shelo lishma balishma. And what the tzaddikim describe is that it doesn't mean that eventually I'll graduate from the darga of lo lishma, of inauthenticity, and arrive at the status of lishma, or authenticity, but rather nested within the sheath or the husk of inauthenticity rests a kernel of authenticity, which is the secret of authentically pretending. The Me'or Einayim has an amazing way of understanding this Maimer Chazal of La'olam Yomad Adam Shaloi Lishma Ki B'toch Shaloi Lishma Balishma, that a person should always learn for inauthentic purposes, because then a person will come to learn for authentic purposes. So the Me'or Einayim says that we can read La'olam as this will always be the suggestion. This is what one should always do when they find themselves in the circumstance. But the Me'or Einayim says differently. La'olam doesn't mean this is what one should always do, but rather La'olam, this is what one will always be doing, meaning to say it is a declaration of the status of what it means to be a human being, that this will always be the process, that will always be transitioning from a prior stage of inauthenticity, ascending to a new stage of authenticity, only to come to realize that that stage of authenticity is also caught up in a certain element of inauthenticity, not because the inauthenticity is rooted in human frailty or human error or human failure or human fallacy, but rather because we're human beings, and true lishma 100% of the time is an impossibility because we can't grasp perfection. So that gives us permission, especially in line with Rabbi Nachman and the secret of Ki'ilu, and the secret that everything is just pretending ultimately, that gives us permission to enter into the space where we might be able to find for ourselves a process wherein we are going to be able to contemplate, enter in, and experience a certain state of calmness of spirit, a certain state of elevation of spirit, a state of a relinquishment from the anxieties that typically hound us, a state of removing myself from concern over possession, from concern over positioning or posturing, and actually enter into a mind place and a makom of yichud, in the mind, that it's okay for that to be rooted in a certain pretending. That being said, what we're going to speak about now is how this very gesture, the very gesture necessary for even beginning the process of contemplating the notion of Yichudim, is also going to be the first tool necessary in the entryway into what it means to be a person who contemplates and a person who tries to have a relationship with the Rabbanu Shlalem by way of Yichudim. That dimyon de Kedusha, the nature of the process of beginning, of beginning to access the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in our own minds by way of Yichudim, by way of contemplating certain things and owning the power of my own mind to hold within it the vistas and the landscapes of actual things, is going to be the utilization of imagination. Now, the utilization of imagination is nothing new, especially in the writings of the Rebbe, but it's a notion that has been cultivated throughout by the Bali Nevi'im, by the Bnei Nevi'im, by the tzaddikim in our generation, by the tzaddikim in previous generations, the Piazetzner Rebbe, Hashem Yimkom Domo, the Kozhnitzer Magid, and then when you go back to the Rishonim and to the Kadmonim, you find various treaties and explanations of what it means to be a Bal Mizbainin, what it means to have this capacity of imagination, of creating images within one's mind. This notion of dimyon, the utilization of imagination, Rav Simcha ben Mepshischa, and rightfully so, Rav Simcha ben Mepshischa was the one who said that Adam, the language of Adam, what it means to be a human being, is actually the capacity to be an imagining creature. That Dimyon and Adam come from the same etymological root, meaning to say that imagination is not simply one trait amongst others that the human being engages in, but rather imagination is the end-all, be-all of what it means to be a human being, as the tzaddikim have described, that Dimyon is an extended territory that is rooted in the loftiest places and descends down into the lowest places. Because as we know, what is imagination? What is the capacity of imagining? Now, the mind naturally desires to have some sort of imageal perspective upon which I can grasp and hold on to what it is that I'm trying to think about. When I'm trying to orient myself towards a specific building, so I have a mental image of what that building is. If I'm trying to orient myself towards a particular book or a particular person, I am capable of recollecting that image that is imprinted within my memory of vision and recalling it and being able to see it again. But what happens when a person wants to try and bring to mind something that they haven't necessarily been exposed to? What happens when the thing that is emerging within the mind is not something that has a counterpoint in actualized reality that I can call upon in order to recollect that image in the mind and create a real experience of it? What happens when I'm trying to make an image out of something that is imageless? What happens when I'm trying to envision that which cannot be grasped in vision? Because this is ultimately what the Torah HaKadosh is coming to say. The entirety of the Torah, on one degree or another, is the purification of faith from the necessity of an icon. An icon is something that can be seen. An icon is an idol. An icon is something that is measured and grasped and weighed, and it has a particular weight and mass and cost to it, something very manageable that I can place in my back pocket, like we see by Paro and his ability to stand upon the Yaor. As the Meshilach points out, the Yaor was his higher power, so how could he stand upon it? But rather the notion of a higher power that can be measured or mitigated or limited into some framework of measurability will ultimately be one that the human being can simply utilize or possess and utilize to their own purposes. So therefore comes along Avram Avinu as the first iconoclast, the shatterer of idols, and he says, I don't want anything that is necessarily visible. I want something that is invisible. It's the invisibility of all things that I'm trying to access, the infinite, the Ein Sof, that bilti gvul, that which does not emerge into the framework of my field of vision or into my capacity to allocate certain measurements to it. And therefore, at the heart of the Torah HaKadosh, at the heart of the quest of Avraham for faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is this question of how do I make an image out of that which is imageless? Because on the one hand, I cannot make an image of God. That is prohibited in all matters of prohibition. The entirety of the Torah is focused on that. At the same point, everything that we're doing, including what the Torah itself is doing, is creating images for us and offering forms of images that need to be abstracted to the proper place through the notions of anthropomorphism, etc. But we need to strip those images of any of the physical manifestation or the hagshama or the materialization of those things. So on the one hand, there can be no image. On the other hand, there has to be an image, but that image that is necessary still cannot be an image. So it's an imageless image, or it's an image of imagelessness, meaning to say that the Torah is teaching us how to behold through the mind's eye to one degree or another, as well as the heart's ear, how to behold that which is invisible through vision, to see the invisible. And in spite of the fact that we're not seeing it, to believe that through the creation of the vision within our mind, we're actually accessing it. And this notion of imagination is the capacity wherein we access this ability. Imagination is from the language of creating an image. An image is being conjured up in one's mind in spite of the fact that there's no evidence or nodal point in reality that I can root myself back in and say, oh, that's what I'm basing this vision upon. And therefore, imagination is the ability for a person to gain access into a particular state of mind that is not necessarily based on any previous memory of that state of mind, because that state of mind is not rooted in the actual physicalized expression of this worldliness. So imagination has to be able to create an image ex nihilo, so to speak, yesh me'ayin kavyachol, because we're rooted in that place. And that is the secret of imagination. So obviously, viewed in a negative lens, imagination can lead a person astray in all manners of being astray. It could be an imagination of something negative. It can be the imagination of a certain sense of self or a certain relationship or posturing towards other people. It's the source, as the Rambam spends so much time describing in Shemona Prakim and in Mar Nevuchim, it's the source of shigayon, it's the source of the opposite of a rational faith. But at the same point, the capacity to make that which is not present, present, to imagine that which is imageless, to conjure up that which cannot be conjured, to grasp that which is ungraspable, is also the bedrock of faith, is also the bedrock of what we're trying to do in Yichudim, and therefore imagination continues to remain the crowning jewel of the spiritual identity, as all of the tzaddikim have pointed out, through the power of chalomos, through the power of dimyon de kedusha, the refinement of imagination. This is going to be the entry point wherein a person accesses the pathway of the ladder that's leading upwards to the Rebbeinu Shalom. And for the Rebbe, based on all of the tzaddikim, Dimyon is associated with the lowest sira. Dimyon is associated with malchus. It's associated with that impoverished space of self as it expresses itself within the space of itself, meaning to say it is the point of encounter of me as a personality in this moment as a question of time, and in this particular pace as a question of space, which is Olam Shalom V'Nefesh, all of them unifying together to give me the shape of experience. That is an akuda of malchus. That is a rega. That is an ace. That is a moment in this world. And until I can learn how to open my mind up to the capacity of imagination, of healthy imagination, of willing and allowing myself to gain access in my mind to that which I don't have the capacity to recall in any actualized way, I am not going to be able to enter into the palace of Kedusha, because Dimyon is the way that we access. Imagination is the entry point into the process of Yichudim, which is the beginning of hispoinenus. When I am trying to experience calmness, when I am trying to enter into a place where I can access HaKadosh Baruch Hu's expression to me in this world, when I am trying to utilize the various names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the permutations of letters, the colors that I might be contemplating, the experience, the notion of Torah that I might be remembering, the mantra from Tefillah that I might be accessing, in order to create a sense of reality to that in my mind, I need to first and foremost make a decision to drop out of revealed reality. And dropping out of revealed reality is the secret of imagining. When I choose to imagine, when I choose to open myself up to dimyon de kedusha, I am no longer held and I am no longer bound by the regulations and the rules of how I typically function in my wakeful intellectual mind. In my wakeful intellectual mind, b'derech haskala, so I can't begin to create images within my mind that are not real, or I can't begin to contemplate Yud, K, Vav, K, in addition to Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, even though that's not where my mind is at, and even though my mind is filled with all other sorts of thoughts at the same moment. But through imagination, through the willingness to make real that which is not real, to make present that which is absent, to make visible that which is invisible, to make tangible that was intangible, that impossible leap of imagination, which very much in line with our capacity to orient ourselves towards behaving like God, so to speak, is the closest thing that we can do to creating something out of nothing, the possibility of imagining, in spite of the fact that every imagining is rooted in previous notions of thought. It is this capacity to enter into the gate of Dimyon, to enter in to that palace of the mind where I am now going to believe in the visions in my mind. I'm going to believe that by thinking Yud, K, Vav, K, and even seeing the four letters together, even though they're kind of difficult and they flicker in front of the mind's eye for a person who's incapable of visualization, nevertheless, by choosing to believe in those very, very light boundaries of the Yud, K, Vav, K, allows me to then look at them again and to allow them to come into sharper focus. And the more I allow myself myself to linger in the dimyon, in imagination, which offers a defense system against every thought that's going to try and take me away from it. Because most thoughts that tell me I'm unworthy or incapable or not good enough, those are only reasonable thoughts when I'm dealing with a reasonable sense of mind. But when I'm accessing the point of imagination, it no longer matters what the reasonable mind is saying. I'm in a state of imagination. And it's specifically this place, this kedushas hadimyon, this allowance to allow oneself to sit. And we're going to talk about the posturing, and we're going to talk about where to sit and how to sit and when to sit and what the light should be and what the sounds should be ultimately. But first and foremost, a person, just as we have to give ourselves permission to act as if in order to enter into this place, the first entry point into the place itself is the dimyon de kedusha. And dimyon ultimately is not going to be the end goal. We're not talking about an entire edifice of imaginings and dimyonos, because while that's fine and that's not going to harm anybody, ultimately it can lead a person astray in every manner of astrayness, and it will also lead to kind of frustration and disappointment and just an elongation and a stretching of the distinction between my reality and my ideal sense of self, of where I would truly want to be. Meaning there is the real and there is the ideal. The real is how I actually am in accordance with the boundaries of my functioning self and reality, and the ideal is how I imagine myself. Now, if I spend my entire life in fantasy and imaginings without any groundedness in actuality, that's just going to carry me away, feeling farther and farther from who I actually am. And ultimately, it's not enough to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'dimyon, because serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu and being miyached Yichudim is far more than dimyon. It's a real ontological thing. It's a real thing. It has a real impact in this world. When I contemplate the Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei, and then I contemplate the Shem Aleph Daled Nun Yud, and then I allow those letters to intersperse themselves together, I have now engaged in a new expression of the Ribono Shel Olam in this world. And the Yichudim can be poyel mamish. They can be poyel pu'ulos mamish. They are poyel pu'ulos mamish for the individual themselves. They're poyel pu'ulos mamish for the entire klal, for the avir that a person is in. Our mind is a powerful thing. Our mind and our thoughts and our imaginings. This is ultimately the deepest secret of Yichudim, that the mind of a Yid is so powerful that it can actually import a real change on reality. Now, we're going to see all of the fundamental distinctions between this and other foreign forms of thinking in terms of manifestation when misunderstood, and the notion that the mind itself is the tool that manifests. God forbid, as the Rebbe has made very, very clear in an important nekuda clarifying the power of thoughts, the notion of trach gut v'zayin gut, think good and it will be good, is not that the mind has any access point to reality. The mind is a created thing, just like anything else, and ascribing any spiritual infinitude or standalone power to any physical or megusham object is tantamount to the greatest form of avodah zarah. So it's not the mind that is being poiled these things. It's not the mind that is thinking good and mamela forcing the world to be good. But as the Rebbe points out, the mind has a segula that when I access my mind properly enough, HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes that as an action that will be met with a reaction of a descent, of an expression of vitality and sustenance from above. Meaning to say that thoughts and the contemplation and the yichudim that I'm engaged in my mind are ultimately segulas. There's segula for the ha'ara that is going to come afterwards. As the Ramchal says in the beginning of Parak Chaf Vav, at the end of Mesilas Yesharim, which is the secret of Ruach HaKodesh, it's that tchilaso avoda v'soifa matana. The beginning is work, the beginning is a segula, but the end is going to be a matana. So it's far more than just a dimyon. The metzias of what we're trying to access is real. It's a mamish thing, but the fact is that the only way into that real thing is by allowing ourselves to believe in something real that we don't have access to, which is what we refer to as dimyon. And this is what the Rebbe says in Hishal Shudas Drasha. Nishal Shudas Drasha. I'm sorry, not Nishal Shudas Drasha. This is from Derech HaYichud, which we're going to be learning inside Be'ezras Hashem. But the Rebbe is explaining that the access point to the work of Yichudim is Malchus, is Dimyon, where we're sitting and we're allowing ourselves. But that's not the Tachlis. The Tachlis is Or HaChachma. The Tachlis is Bittul B'Metzias. The Tachlis is understanding the Shem Havaya with the Nekudos, which is what the Siddur HaRashash is ultimately based on, and allowing the Or Ein Sof Kav Yachol to be mislabish in the Chachma of our minds, because we are integrally connected with our Chachma, and that's where the most Bittul can come about. So the ultimate goal is not just the dimyon of Malchus, but rather the ultimate goal is the or mamish of Chachma. Amnan or ha-Chachma atzmo eno dimyon chas v'shalom. The Rebbe says that the light of Chachma, the light of wisdom, the access point to these shemos, this real contemplation and quietude within the self, that's not a dimyon, ela ha-dimyon hu pesach lo, but rather imagination and allowance of the utilization of imagination, of the creation of that which is not there and allowing it to be there. That's the entry point. Sha'al yidei shemitzayer, Maspik Zman as orb demyono, that through the imagining and the creation for long enough in the mind of this light, of whatever light I'm trying to contemplate. This is simply imagination and it's not an actual reality. But it's specifically through this dimyon, this unrealness, that that gives me the access point into Chachma, the secret of Malchus. Malchus being the entry point, the shar, shar la Hashem tzadikim yovo bo, bezois yavo Aaron el hakodesh. It's specifically with this decision to be medam milsa milsa. Ha'adam chafshi b'dimyono. A person is free in their imagination, because imagination frees me from the confines of what is real in my life and what is ultimately present in my life. And it's specifically through that I have the ability to ascend upwards afterwards into the light of Chachma. And then once I've accessed that point of bittul b'metzias, that nullification of self, where I am no longer seeing myself as an individualized creature, but rather as an expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's infinite expression of light, then once I enter there, then I can experience an or Eloki mamish, and then az misbatel hadimyon v'nishar ha'onei Eloki bilvad. At that point, the imagination, the handmaiden that has brought me there, is going to be negated. And what I'm going to be left with, which is the real thing, which is the hargasha amitis of tainug de kedusha. Now, tainug de kedusha, which is the fundamental point of all yichudim, is ultimately not so that we can experience pleasure, because it's an unfelt pleasure that's ultimately going to be the highest thing we have access to, but it's because that's the siman muvhak, oineg, 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 tainug, 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 pleasure, a certain form of comfort and alleviation of distress, is going to be the mark that truly shows the person that they've been engaged in a process of yichudim. And it's specifically through the utilization of dimyon that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us, as the Rebbe says, that tzrichim es ha'avoida shel malchus b'derech hadimyon de kedusha, that a person needs to utilize the power of their imagination in a holy way, to allow myself to imagine myself to be shaykh to the Rebbeinu Shleilim, to allow myself to be connected to the Rebbeinu Shleilim. Lord knows that we utilize our imagination to convince ourselves of everything opposite being close to the Rebbeinu Shleilim. Our dimyonas tell us that we're the worst, and we're the lowest, and we're the most shameful, etc., etc. We listen to our dimyon about everything in the world that takes us away from feeling good and positive about our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and our role in this world. But when it comes to utilizing the dimyon to feel good about oneself, to value oneself, to find nekudos tovos in oneself, there we're the biggest koifrim. There we're koifer in our nekudos tovos. The hardest thing to believe in is one's nekudos tovos, and it's through the utilization of dimyon de kedusha that allow myself to suspend my disbelief for a moment and allow myself to imagine, to be madama milsa la milsa, and to allow myself to open myself up to the possibility that I too am shaykh to the avodah, I too am shaykh to the tzaddik, I too am shaykh to the or kitov. And in that way, a person is going to gain access. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to rectify the dimyon. And what does it mean on a practical level? If I have to begin, the Piasetzner Rebbe talks about this as well, and the Rebbe talks about this explicitly, that the dimyon is to allow myself to utilize certain notions in relationship to how I contemplate the Rabbeinu Shleilim, how I contemplate goodness in this world, how I contemplate the letters, how I contemplate the or, that light, that undefined notion of light, which is the only metaphor available because it is something that is not real and real at once. It's real, but it can't be accessed by any way of human grasp, and therefore it's utilized, says the Ramchal, as the fundamental expression of Ruchnius. But I can utilize my imagination, and the Piasetzner Rebbe Hashem Yom Kamadomo brings a tremendous chiddush in not Achsharas Avrechim, in Bnei Machshava Tova from the Ravid HaKadosh, that even in order to come and gain access to the Rebbeinu Shleilim, one can rely on the Ravid, who allows one to contemplate certain anthropomorphic imaginings of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in order to come close to the Rebbeinu Shleilim. Now, we have to be mapshit. The fundamental truth of everything is always to abstract, and to ensure that we're fundamentally aware that nothing that we're imagining, none of the limitations, none of the measurements, none of the letters, none of the lights, none of the partsufim, none of the concepts, none of that exists whatsoever when it comes to the infinite. The infinite is infinite in all matters of infinitude. Yes, it contains all koach and potential of expression eventually, but none of that is limiting. And the fundamental truth is for us to hold on to that notion that everything that I'm going to imagine is simply oznayim. It's only from my perspective, a handle that I can grab on. That is the fundamental cord that we need to hold on to. And once a person has that understanding, then we don't have to be so afraid that we're going to be coming to Magshem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because we have no grasp of anything whatsoever. We're fully aware of that. And Mamela, we don't have to be so afraid of the Shemos. We don't have to be so afraid of contemplating the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a partsuf that's referred to as Atek Yoimin and Arach Anpin and Zer Anpin and Nukva and Abba Ve'ima. These words stop being so terrifying. They stop reminding us of this materialism or a metaphysical kind of physical thing, and allows us to access a real ha'ara, a real hasaga of the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the most real thing in the world, in spite of the fact that we can't fully grasp it. And the entry point there is going to be the capacity of Dimyon. Because in truth, a person is not allowed to deviate their mind away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and a person is always davening. The person always has to be thinking about how HaKadosh Baruch Hu fills all worlds and creates all worlds and orients all worlds, and to utilize l'shtamich b'derech dimyon de kedusha, to engage in our imaginations. A person shouldn't negate the value of imagination. The capacity to connect to the Rabbanu Shalom through imagination is a profoundly ascended level. And a person has to ensure that they're not coming and physicalizing or being magshim the power of imagination, not to think that the way that I imagine things to be is the way that it is above. This allowance to myself, or this utilization of concepts or images that I need in order to grab hold a little bit of that which is infinite, to believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu could be accessed through letters, to believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu could be accessed through the notion of light, as if even these most refined concepts exist there. That's just dimyon de kedusha. That's just an imagination, and then it has to be undone and erased for the recognition that it's still just an imagination, but that's going to be the entry point. A person should not, God forbid, come to chas v'shalom think that these things are actually above. But rather, a person has to understand that above, there's no existence whatsoever except for the simple and singularly unified light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Again, this is found in the drasha of the Rebbe in Parshas Tetzaveh from Tafshin Samech Hey. Amnan. Nevertheless, the trait of Malchus is the gate, it's the opening towards which HaKadosh Baruch Hu allows us to enter into the ascendant worlds. And in truth, above, there are no images, there's no imagination, there's no measurement that we can conceivably contemplate, but rather through the koyach of dimyon de kedusha, this koyach of the nefesh, to make something that's not real, to make the immeasurable measured without ever falling trap into the notion that it might be a real measure, but a measureless measure, the nukud of malchus that allows this mirage-like real but unreal thing, mitzvah she'ena b'mitzvah, a non-existent, existent thing, a dimyon, an imagination, a chalom that is real while I'm in it and not real when I'm out of it. It's what allows us to have access to them. It's the beginning, it's the gate, it's the haschala, it's the mafteach shenim seitz lashchina kadosha. And this ultimate secret of dimyon is also the secret of emuna. Emuna is the capacity of yesh me'ayin, to allow myself to believe she'emuna beside a dimyon de kedusha. It's an imagination because I don't know anything. I don't have proof of anything. And in truth, there's nothing more beautiful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu than the utilizations of these lower levels. Because when we elevate that which is low within us, our imagination, and we allow ourselves to contemplate and imagine the world to be the beautiful place we know it to be, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be as present as we know him to be, and the Shem Havaya to be as powerful as we know it to be, and the Neshama of Yisrael to be as tahar as we know it to be. It's only through the koyach of dimyon de kedusha that we can demand from ourselves the revelation of all that we know to be true in the deepest parts of our dimyon. But again, imagination needs to be grounded in content. It needs to be grounded in Torah and Tefillah and Mitzvah. It needs to be grounded and tethered to the ground, because otherwise it's an easy thing to float off in imagination and malchus without any connection to anything else. That's what's referred to as koitzeitz benetios, where all a person has is malchus without anything else. A person needs to take malchus and be miyached. Every time I utilize my imagination to access a relationship with a Rabbanu Shalom or a shame or any notion of a Kadosh Baruch Hu's gilui or a concept of hashgacha, so that's my dimyon being niftach. That's malchus. That's shechina. That's me. And my goal is to allow that to then become the site of the emes, the site of a real access point where a Kadosh Baruch Hu is mashpia, a certain ha'ara, a certain hargasha, a certain feeling of a birur, of having clarified some element of concealment in this world and coming to a little bit more knowledge of the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Malech ha'aretz chvoidoi and v'leis asar panim minei. V'emes zu madrega shel kasher yidaber ish al re'ehu. And this capacity, says the Rebbe, of imagination is the darga that Rabbi Nachman spoke about when it came to his spoidedus, when it came to speaking to somebody, because a person can also speak in their thoughts and a person can also speak in their imagination. We should be able to imagine so much. We should be able to imagine so much that we're sitting right in front of the Rebbeinu Shalom, that we can begin to talk, and by talking, we make that imagination a little bit more real, and we access the ability to be Mekusher HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The secret of the Hispaidus, the secret of the ability to be Medaber Yasher HaKadosh Baruch Hu in those moments of imagination is to take the imagination and make it real. When a person begins any type of avodah, when a person begins to try and enter into a 10-minute period of contemplating Einon Levada, or thinking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or trying to accomplish Shavisi Hashem Nenegdi Tamid, where they're actually thinking about the shape and the mark of the letters themselves of Yud Kei Vav Kei, so that even if I have the capacity to enter into the shar of Amuna and Dimyon, the natural tendency of the individual is going to be to suddenly be distracted or to doubt their capacity to be there and run away very quickly or move because the mind has fallen prey to another thought, which we're going to speak about Be'ezras Hashem next week, the way that we slow down our thoughts to allow ourselves to focus in on the one particular thought of Dimyon, the Kedusha. But the Dibor aspect of it, and the Dibor b'machshava as well, is that I need to be mamshich the Dimyon. I need to say I am actively entering into a state of imagining myself to be Ra'ui, of sitting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and thinking about his names, thinking about him, thinking about Mali Kalam and Soviv Kalam and the Leis Asar Panimine, thinking about Bina and Chachma and Kesser, thinking about all the things that I read about and that I speak about, and believing that they can actually have a real impact on my life, and that I most importantly, can actually have a real impact on the Metzius itself. And in order to maintain that delicate thought, that delicate dimyon, that delicate allowance, or that momentary disbelief when the rational mind is kind of a slumber and the dimyon and the chalom is ma'ir in a person's mind, which we tend to look at first glance and say, no, that's just malchus, that's just dimyon, it's too low for me, I don't want to access it. We have to begin to speak it out. We have to be mamshich it. We have to connect ourselves to it and believe in it and realize that, okay, right now is an opportune moment for me to be able to access the Rebbeinu Shalom. It doesn't matter how, it doesn't matter where, as the Piyasetzner Rebbe pointed out to us. Any opportunity where the dimyon is elicited and a person is now in a state of contemplating or daydreaming their relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom, it has to be a moment that I jump into. And that's the secret of Malchus, that it's bezois yavo ela kodesh. Every moment has to be a Pesach. Every moment of imagining has to be a Pesach, where I imagine the only thing that I should truly try and imagine, which is that which is truly imageless, which is the Or Ein Sof Kavyachal, HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvodo v'atzmo, who is not represented in any letter, even the Kutzel Shayud, or even the most dak shebedak, abstract shebe-abstract concepts or forms. None of them hold a candle to even begin to offer any type of actual definition to even the slightest expression of what we could possibly know about the Rebbeinu Shalom. Everything is reminding us of the Dimyon, the Kedusha, but it's the secret of entering into the place where it becomes real, Be'ezras Hashem.